crews of the outfit.
An outfit crew with a rich history that all began with a violent hostile takeover,
and then became the most powerful crew of the most powerful mafia family in the nation.
The outfit's one and only Cicero crew. The Cicero crew is a legendary and historic street crew of the Chicago outfit. It has long been an important faction of the family and has served as the cornerstone of the entire organization. Cicero became synonymous with the most iconic mobster to ever live, Al Capone, because the big guy had a lot to do with the Cicero crew's origin and development. The outfit's roots in Cicero originated when Al Capone moved his base of operations to Cicero in the 1920s to evade Chicago laws and their police force. Al Capone and Johnny Torrio established Cicero as a safe haven for the outfit's bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution rackets, effectively taking over the suburb's municipal government. They ultimately built an empire of organized crime and corruption in this community. The boundaries for the town were drawn out in 1849, and the name Cicero was decided because it took after the name of Roman statesman Marcus Tullius Cicero that proposed democratic principles in the 1st century in Rome. Cicero was the very first suburb in the Chicago metro area that had organized crime influence, and it served as a primary stronghold for the outfit's operations outside Chicago city limits during the Prohibition era and beyond. The Cicero-based crew became a foundational, powerful faction of the outfit and has remained a consistent element of the Chicago outfit's suburban infrastructure for nearly a century. Chicago has been a nexus for organized crime in the United States and a hotbed for criminal gangs during the turn of the century. Everything would change in the Windy City underworld when pimp and restaurateur Big Jim Colosimo got fed up with the Black Hand extortion threats he was constantly getting, but wasn't equipped to fend them off. He wasn't sure how to deal with them, so he called a relative of his wife who he thought could help. Little side note, some sources claim Big Jim is Torrio's uncle and others say that Torrio was related to his wife. Unfortunately, there's no evidence to support either claim. Nevertheless, for the sake of this video, we're going to subscribe to the latter. Jim didn't know just how lucky he was because that relative was New York gangster and racketeer John Torrio. Torrio was a nice guy and always willing to help and didn't want to leave him hanging, so he came to his rescue and arrived in Chicago in 1909 to help Colosimo get rid of his Black Hand problem. This quiet little guy with button eyes doesn't look like much, but Torrio could only be described as one of the finest criminal minds of the 20th century. Torrio is nothing short of a mafia legend and one of the founding fathers of American Cosa Nostra. He was a highly intelligent racketeer, a fearless gangster, a visionary of vice, and a born leader. But like most mob heavyweights from back then, Torrio came from humble beginnings. Born in Italy in 1882, Torrio's father, a railway worker, would die in a work-related accident when Johnny was 2. His widowed mother took young Johnny and immigrated to America, settling in the slums of the Lower East Side of New York. His mother would eventually remarry and young Johnny would go to work in his stepdad's variety store, which functioned more like a tavern or drinking parlor. Wise beyond his years, Johnny would do a little loan sharking and bookmaking on the side in his stepdad's joint at an unusually young age. He would venture deeper into criminality when he spearheaded a local gang called the James Street Gang. He was considered a leader within the gang, if not the leader. The gang operated your normal gambling and loan sharking rackets in addition to the various other schemes Torrio was running. John had an almost genius-level business acumen and was a money-making machine. Eventually, the gang scraped enough money together and opened a billiards parlor, which served as the base of their operations. There, they turned up the scale of their operation and the gang was thriving. At some point, Torrio began promoting boxing matches, where he met a bantamweight fighter and gangland kingpin who went by the name of Paul Kelly, even though his real name was Paolo Antonini Vaccarelli. Back then, Italian boxers took Irish names as aliases so they could get more and better fights. Kelly was a suave racketeer and gentleman gangster who led the 5 Points Gang, a mob that ran Little Italy and fixed elections for Tammany Hall and, quite frankly, was arguably the largest street gang in New York at the time. Kelly took an immediate liking to Torrio, schooling the young gangster on how to dress, speak, and steal like a proper mafioso. Then in 1905, the James Street Gang was merged into the larger 5 Points Gang, and Torrio became Kelly's lieutenant. While working under Kelly, Torrio focused his attention on the Brooklyn docks, where he ran both legitimate businesses and vice rackets. Johnny was heavily involved in bars, brothels, and bookmaking. He oversaw several illegal operations, including gambling, loan sharking, prostitution, drug trafficking, and various other criminal endeavors. It was around this time that a teenage Al Capone also joined the 5 Points Gang. Seeing Capone's potential, Torrio took him under his wing, teaching him the ways of the wise guy and everything he needs to know about the world of organized crime. Al and his older brother Frank took on roles as enforcers for the gang, and more specifically for Johnny Torrio. Torrio was also reportedly the one that secured Capone a job as a bouncer at the Harvard Inn through a 5 Points gang cohort and owner of the joint, Frankie Yale, who would also form a friendship with Capone. Didn't take long for Torrio to move up the ranks, becoming Kelly's right-hand man, a top earner, and a leader within the gang. And it seemed like everyone was going to Torrio for guidance or advice. He was like the mafia shaman. He had a lot of underlings and proteges, but his main muscle were the Capone brothers, Frank, Al, and Ralph. In Chicago, Johnny knew things may get messy trying to rid his Chicago allies from those pesky black-handers, and he knew it would be a whole lot better if he had a few of his own guys, so shortly after he got settled in, he asked the Capone brothers to join him there. Coming up in the highly competitive New York underworld under the tutelage of Torrio made the Capone brothers fiercely loyal to him, and they were happy to oblige and relocate to help out their mentor. In Chicago, Torrio went to work for pimp and restaurateur Jim Colosimo. He quickly got rid of all the Black Hand threats and brought over the Capone brothers. Things were going smoothly until Torrio was shocked and appalled by the notion of not participating in bootlegging illegal alcohol when Prohibition hit. Colosimo was content with what he had going on, which was mainly brothels, his popular restaurant, and a few gambling operations, and he refused to get involved in bootlegging. Torrio knew that Prohibition presented a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity and could potentially be a huge moneymaker where they all could make life-changing amounts of cash. Colosimo divorced Torrio's relative and married one of his prostitutes/dancers, which kept him distracted from running his organization and keeping everyone's pockets filled. So now Torrio didn't have a reason to be loyal to him anymore. Plus he felt that he was being highly negligent to their operation and wasn't about to let an opportunity like bootlegging pass him by. So he decided to take over and have Colosimo whacked. By 1920, Torrio had taken charge of the Southside Gang and Prohibition era had started. With Torrio now at the helm, their organization was thriving, and as the gang increased in power and wealth, so did Al and Frank. Johnny took full advantage of Prohibition, and the Southsiders had the largest operation going in a city with many other gangs in operation. These guys were building their wealth exponentially during these years, as were many other mafiosi around the country. By the mid-1920s, 31% of the Chicago underworld were with an Italian background, 29% were of Irish background, 20% Jewish, and 12% were black. So it became increasingly clear that organized crime in Chicago was now dominated by Italians headed by the Torrio Capone gang. Chicago came early and strong with the political corruption. They had Chicago Mayor William Big Bill Thompson on their payroll, which made things a lot easier for them to operate their illegal activities. But as we of course know, all good things must come to an end. In 1923, Chicago voters elected a new mayor. Thompson was out and William Deaver was in. And this was not good for Torrio as Deaver proceeded to crack down on organized crime, primarily the Italian element. He was not going to be bought off like his predecessor, Big Bill Thompson, and seemingly had a vendetta against Torrio, the Capone brothers, and their Southside gang. Torrio then instructed the Capone brothers to find another base of operation that was outside the city limits and free of Chicago laws and Deaver's jurisdiction. Meanwhile, Jewish racketeer and Capone ally Eddie Vogel needed help rigging an election in a bordering Chicago suburb of Cicero where he operated. Vogel knew that if his choice as puppet mayor, Joseph Glenna, was elected, then Cicero would be a wide open town for gambling, booze, and prostitution. They could operate unimpeded by law enforcement. Millions were to be made for all the gangs who played along. So Vogel invited the Capone brothers into the neighboring suburb to help him get his guy into office. This all coincided with the new mayor, Deaver, ushering in a new regime dedicated to bringing down Italian organized crime in Chicago. So the timing couldn't have been better, as Capone was tasked with finding a new base of operations outside the city limits, and this opportunity fell into his lap. Cicero seemed like the perfect spot for them to set up shop outside of Chicago. Cicero had 143 saloons where the majority supported and permitted illegal gambling operations in the community, and Torrio wanted to take them all over, but in order to do so they needed their Republican candidate to win this election. So the first order of business, to get their guy installed as mayor, because a corrupt mayor would ease the mass expansion of Torrio's empire into Cicero. Joseph Clenna was currently serving on the town committee and was immediately put on the outfit's payroll. The Capone gang just needed to do whatever they could to get this guy elected, by any means necessary. At this point in time, Frank was more prominent in the gang than Al was. He was older and more refined, and he was one tough dude. Frank Capone's job was to represent the gang in its dealings with the Cicero Town Council and its politicians. Frank was mild-mannered compared to his brother Al, projecting an image of a dapper and respectable businessman, always looking sharp and dressed in a neat suit. But don't let that fool you, sometimes it's the quiet ones that are more violent and ruthless. And that sentiment rings true in the case of Frank Capone. Like a social chameleon, Frank could comfortably host a dinner with the top politicians and city officials and then turn around and lead a gang of killers and hoodlums in a battle. Most mob historians surmise that Frank was far more ruthless and violent than his younger brothers. Supposedly, for instance, Al Capone's motto was, "Always try to deal before you have to kill." While Frank had no such disposition, he would reportedly say, "You never get no talk back from no corpse." In the April of 24 Cicero municipal election, the Democratic Party politicians chose Rudolph J. Hurt as their candidate to run against Clinton. Frank Capone was eager to accept the challenge and was put in charge of pushing voters to vote for Clinton by any means necessary. March 31st, 1924 was complete chaos on the streets of Cicero as rioters supporting both sides clashed and brawled in the streets. Frank unleashed a wave of terror on the city. Frank Capone completely took over the voting polls as his henchmen stood guard with Tommy guns and sawed-off shotguns telling people to vote for Clinton. If any voters were known not to vote Republican, they were pushed to vote that way. If people refused, they were either beaten on the spot or sent home and not allowed to vote. Elected officials weren't capable of stopping Frank Capone because they had no weapons or firepower to combat several armed men at the polling stations. Any officials who spoke up against the gang were kidnapped until the end of the election, while 3 people were shot to death and another one had his throat slashed. The Chicago outfit made Hurt and his campaign managers really suffer for daring to oppose them. Later in the day, Frank led an attack on the headquarters of Rudolph Hurt. They ransacked his office and lit up the place in a hail of automatic gunfire. Hurt narrowly escaped as gunmen blasted at him, nearly mowing him down in a barrage of .45 caliber gunfire from the gangster's typewriter of death. One campaign worker was shot in both legs and detained with 8 other campaign workers to be released when election day was over. Outfit guys were sent to another part of town to the office of William K. Flume, who was the Democratic candidate for town clerk. 6 henchmen burst into Flume's office and pistol whipped him with their revolvers, and punched other campaign workers at the scene in the face with brass knuckles after they tried to stop the attack. The gangsters then shot bullets into the ceiling before they fled the scene. All this happened while Flume's wife, sister, and son witnessed the attack. As election day turmoil progressed, outraged Cicero citizens petitioned Cook County Judge Edmund Jericho for help. So he contacted Chicago Mayor Deaver for advice how to handle these guys. Deaver was happy to help and instructed the Chicago Police Department to send 70 plainclothes officers to Cicero to maintain order at the polls, and Judge Jericho swore them in as deputy sheriffs. The CPD officers did not arrive on the streets of Cicero until late afternoon, at which point they had little effect on the election-related violence. Around dusk, a detective squad led by Sergeant William Cusack pulled up to the polling station at Cicero Avenue and 22nd Street after spotting Frank Capone and his cousin, Charlie Trigger Happy Fischetti, and a third man they didn't recognize. The detectives exited their car and began walking over when gunfire inexplicitly erupted. Witnesses said a swarm of gunfire was sent the gangsters' way, most of it directed at Frank Capone. When the shooting stopped, Frank Capone lay dead, shot multiple times, with the other 2 running off in opposite directions. Several witnesses later claimed the shooting was a one-way affair and the gangsters never opened fire. At a later inquest, the police claimed that Frank Capone shot first. They produced a pistol with 3 missing rounds that they swore Frank used. There's 2 schools of thought on the situation. Either these were rogue cops who were turned loose on Capone and his men. The law apparently decided to fight fire with fire, and these cops were on a mission to take these guys out, or at least the ringleader, which is exactly what they did. Or Frank thought these officers in civilian clothing were rival gangsters, and he was in one of those shoot first and ask questions later kind of mood. In either event, Capone was killed. Fischetti sprinted across a nearby vacant lot, only to toss down his weapon and surrender once the police caught up with him. The third guy ran south, firing a gun in each hand, and managed to escape. Al threw Frank a lavish funeral with a huge turnout. After his death, the Chicago newspapers were full of articles either praising or condemning the CPD. A coroner's inquest later determined that Frank's killing was a justifiable shooting since Frank had been resisting arrest. When the 1924 election was over, Clinton was the new mayor, which became a major victory for Johnny Torrio's Southside gang. Torrio tasked Al with creating speakeasies, brothels, and illegal gambling dens in Cicero. Al Capone got to work springing up several gambling and vice operations and began systematically taking over one saloon after another, forcing them all to do business with him. If there was a refusal, bones were broken, or worse, lives were taken. Capone visited local bootleggers that supplied many of the saloons and paid a lot of them off. The ones that refused entered into a losing war with the Southside Gang. Al Capone then took over the Hawthorne Inn on West 22nd Street and made this his new Cicero headquarters. The outfit found their new stronghold outside the city limits and successfully took it over, beginning a new chapter for the Capone gang and a long marriage between the suburb of Cicero and the outfit. The beginning of the end for Torrio in Chicago took place in May of 24 after Torrio took a pinch for probation violations and was handed a 9-month stretch in the Lake County Jail. Right before he was set to report to jail to serve his time, his Northside rivals took a shot at him. Just a couple days before he was supposed to report to jail, John and Anna Torrio pulled up to their apartment building in a chauffeured Lincoln they borrowed from Jake Guzik because Johnny's car was in the shop. Anna stepped out of the car and walked to the apartment while John gathered bags full of newly purchased items from the vehicle. Apparently, no one noticed the black Cadillac with no license plates that was parked at the corner. As Ann walked up to the front door and John continued gathering bags, the Cadillac slowly moved forward. As she pushed the door open, backing inside since her hands were full, the Cadillac stopped directly across the street. Ann could see what appeared to be 4 men inside the car, all holding guns. She started to scream as Torrio stepped out of the car and onto the sidewalk, but it was too late. She could only watch helplessly as 2 men, later determined to be George Bugs Moran and Jaime Weiss, climbed out of the Cadillac with automatics drawn and ran toward her husband. Torrio made a dash towards the building, but not before Moran and Weiss got off some shots that hit him and he fell to the ground. Moran's shots found their mark, blasting Torrio in the jaw and the chest. As he twisted on the sidewalk, Weiss shot him in the right arm and the groin. At the same time, the 2 men who were still in the Cadillac, Vincent Drucci and Frank Duesenberg, opened fire with their shotguns toward the sedan, shattering windows and tearing holes in the metal. A bullet hit their chauffeur in the leg. Moran then walked up to the wounded and vulnerable Southside boss with a smirk on his face and held his automatic to the fallen man's temple, prepared to give Torrio the coup de grace, final shot to the head, when miraculously for Johnny, his gun either ran out of bullets or jammed. The frustrated would-be assassin let out a couple expletives as Drucci began honking the horn of the Cadillac, signaling frantically that they needed to leave. Moran and Weiss ran back to the car and they sped away. Somehow Torrio managed to crawl toward the apartment building and his wife, who was still screaming, dragged him inside. A neighbor who witnessed the shooting called the police. An ambulance arrived and Torrio was raced to the hospital. And as we know, Torrio managed to survive the ordeal. When he was questioned, he refused to provide any information to investigators. He spoke with difficulty because of his shattered jaw, but managed to say, "Sure, I know all 4 men, but I'll never tell you their names. That's my business." And he never did. Witnesses claim that Al Capone was in tears when he rushed to his boss's hospital bed. After Al made arrangements for Torrio's care and safety, he was taken in for questioning, but of course, provided no information. Of course, the press had a field day with this. Torrio was all over the paper as speculation ran wild. Johnny was happy to be alive, but all this unwanted attention made him very uncomfortable. Torrio would eventually heal up and go off to serve his little bid. He was released after only 45 days for good behavior, although his release was held up when some accused the Lake County Sheriff for providing Torrio with illegal privileges during his incarceration. Torrio apparently had his cell furnished with throw rugs, framed pictures, his own lounge chair, and other comfortable furniture, including a regular bed with a down mattress. He was even permitted to possess a loaded automatic pistol in a cell. He also reportedly left the jail for nights out in the company of the sheriff himself. People noticed and the haters hated. Torrio had to remain in custody as hearings were conducted into the actions of the sheriff. He was eventually released the following week when they couldn't find any proof of wrongdoing. Torrio left Chicago almost immediately after the judge's decision. Torrio and his wife went back to live at their old stomping grounds in Brooklyn, New York. That fall, John and Anna Torrio took a trip to Havana, Cuba with Al and his wife May. At some point during their trip, John handed over his Chicago empire over to Al. When they returned about a month later, Capone went back to Chicago as the newly appointed underworld boss. Then the Torrios headed back to their lavish apartment in Brooklyn. Johnny continued his involvement in the underworld rackets and became a valued and highly respected old-timer, often used for counsel by the biggest and the baddest in New York, guys like Charlie Lucky and Frank Costello. Torrio was also pivotal in the formation of the Five Families and the Commission in 1931. When those who are familiar with John look back at his career, they can't help but be impressed. U.S. Treasury official Elmer Eyre considered him the biggest gangster in America and wrote, and I quote, "He was the smartest and dare I say the best of all hoodlums." Best referring to talent, not morals. Crime journalist Herbert Ashbury affirmed the notion when he said, and I quote, "As an organizer and administrator of underworld affairs, Johnny Torrio is unsurpassed in the annals of American crime. He was probably the nearest thing to a real mastermind that this country has yet produced." Al then took over the reins of the outfit, and now it's his time to shine. His grip on Cicero is undeniable. Cicero became his town and was eventually given the nickname Caponeville. Capone's influence surged all through Cicero, as Al's family members ran several gambling and vice rackets in town. Al placed his brother Ralph in charge of Cicero when he wasn't around. Al's cousins, Charlie and Rocco Fischetti, alternated between driving the big guy and acting as his bodyguard when they weren't distilling bootleg alcohol or running gambling rackets. Rocco also acted as a bodyguard for Al's brothers Ralph, John, and sometimes Matt Capone. John and Matt Capone were involved in the rackets early on, but weren't lifers like Al and Ralph. The Fischetti brothers would go on to have a big presence in Cicero after Al went to prison. They really came into their own after the bodyguard and chauffeur roles ended. They both went hard in the gambling rackets and became very wealthy men with sparse criminal records. Al Capone had a large family. No doubt it was these two who were the most notorious following him. After Prohibition, the Fischetti brothers started running gambling and vice rackets. It was Rocco Fischetti who was soon operating some of the largest illegal gambling establishments in Cicero, and he also ran the notorious Rock Garden Club. Capone's direct influence over Cicero lasted until he was jailed in the fall of 1931 for tax evasion. I don't think there has ever been another mobster to control a suburb quite like Capone controlled Cicero. His legacy resonates in the fabric and the essence of the town, and probably will forever. I'm sure a lot of people thought Capone would return to the throne after serving a little time for a tax evasion pinch. Al and his lawyers never thought he'd get convicted, let alone get handed a 10-year sentence. Most mobsters are drawing up to a 2-year sentence for tax evasion, so it was clear they had it out for Capone. But it wasn't the prison sentence that would do Capone in, it was the syphilis eroding his body that would ultimately take him out. Getting busy with all those prostitutes would end up biting Capone in the ass. The guy successfully navigated the tumultuous Chicago underworld during Prohibition, which was like the Wild Wild West, and survived multiple assassination attempts. But it would be something as careless as barebacking a bunch of hookers that would lead to his demise. The syphilis kicked into high gear during his incarceration, and he was rapidly deteriorating. By the time he got out of prison in '39, the syphilis ravaged his brain and he was a shell of his former self. By that time, Al had the mental prowess of a toddler. He managed to stick it out another 8 years, but finally succumbed to the disease in January of '47. With the loss of Capone, Clinton was not re-elected in the 1932 election. Regardless, now with their foot in the door, the outfit wasn't going anywhere. Fortunately for the organization, Capone had very capable successors that kept a strong hold on Cicero for many years to come. Directly after Capone, leadership over Cicero is a little sketchy. It seems it was ruled by committee. Several sources have Ralph Capone as the official capo. He ran things with Jake Greasy Thumb Guzik, with the oversight of Louis Little New York Campagna. Jake Guzik was an expert racketeer and an enormous earner. Just like he was doing in various areas in Chicago, Jake was loading up every establishment in Cicero he could with slot machines. He eventually became known as the Slot Machine King. Guzik and Vogel had a slot machine in just about every saloon in town, and the majority of the profits went straight into the outfit's pockets. Along with his brothers, Henry and Sam, the Guzik brothers and Eddie Vogel had a virtual monopoly on slot machines in Cicero. Along with the other various gambling enterprises they had going, these men were getting filthy rich. Guzik was a pro at corrupting city officials and law enforcement. He had the chief of police and several officers and Cicero government officials on the outfit's payroll. The transition from Capone to Guzik and Company was indeed a smooth one, which kept the outfit running the suburb, controlling the all-night saloons and almost all the gambling. Two staunch Capone allies who would play a major role for the outfit in Cicero were two St. Louis natives named William Heaney and Claude Maddox. Back in St. Louis, things were a lot different. The Irish gangs were the most dominant, and Maddox wasn't Maddox. He was known as John Moore. Back in the day, young Johnny Moore was in the largest, most powerful gang in St. Louis called Egan's Rats, led by political gangster Tom Egan. In the 1910s, Moore was working under the auspices of Max Greenberg and his future Chicago partner in crime, William Heaney, two Egan's Rats veterans. That was a very violent period in St. Louis. The Egan's Rats were in a bloody gang war with the rival Hogan Gang. Over 15 men were killed within a year's time in the war. A lot of gangsters were considering leaving St. Louis or stay there and get put 6 feet under the ground. Johnny Moore decided to head north to the city of Chicago. Once in Chicago, Moore connected with his old associate and fellow former rat Willie Heaney, who came here 4 years earlier. Then Johnny Moore changed his name to Claude Maddox and made a new identity to protect himself from rival factions back in St. Louis and to avoid his criminal background. Maddox settled on Chicago's north side, which was the territory of the O'Banion gang, but besides that, Maddox operated independently. He belonged to an independent gang formed by exiled gangsters from St. Louis who used their prior ruthless skills they developed in St. Louis for robbing safes and stealing booze. Dean O'Banion didn't tolerate any illegal operations on his turf that weren't ordered by him, and especially if he wasn't getting a cut from the action. Also, Maddox and his guys were known for stealing liquor shipments from the Northsiders. So on November 4th, 1924, Maddox and two of his associates were riding along in their car and didn't realize they were being tailed by a carload of O'Banion gangsters when suddenly the car pulled alongside them and opened fire. They sent a barrage of bullets toward their car, instantly wounding all three passengers. When the cops arrived at the scene, they found Maddox and one of his associates laying on the ground. The guy who was driving was killed. They brought Maddox and his associate to the police station for questioning, but they kept their mouths shut and were later released. 6 days later, Maddox and his gang caught a break when their new enemy and the most notorious gang leader in their area, Dean O'Banion, was assassinated in his flower shop, allegedly by the Capone gang, in collaboration with the Sicilian Jenna brothers and Al's New York buddy Frankie Yale. The old saying, "the enemy of my enemy is my friend," certainly rings true here. So Maddox and his older associate, Willie Heaney, saluted the power move by Al Capone, and they decided to support this up-and-coming Italian criminal organization in Chicago. Claude Maddox and his associates were the first and only group on the north side that supported Al Capone. One of Maddox's closest associates was an Italian mobster named Tony Capizio. Capizio's all-time favorite crime was burglary, so together with Maddox they shared the same love for crime. Tony also had a close connection with the Capone mob, which came from his lifelong friendship with one of the highest-ranking members who went by the name of Frank Nitti. Somewhere around this period, Capizio, together with Maddox, opened an infamous bar on North Avenue, which was called the Circus Cafe. The Circus Cafe was the home base for many gangsters from different territories who were all in alliance with the Capone mob. Both Maddox and Heaney would follow Capone into Cicero and set up shop there. They would go on to form a very ruthless crew in Cicero that would play a major role in the Capone-led outfit. While Capone was accommodated at the Hawthorne Hotel in Cicero, his main protection was the circus gang. Capone was at the top floor and Willie Heaney was at the floor below him. Heaney was considered his chief of staff, meaning if anybody wanted to send a message or make contact with the big fella, Heaney was the go-between guy. Next door to Heaney was Claude Maddox, who was armed to the teeth and also in charge for the security around Capone and the establishment. And a young Tonio Carter was always seated in the lobby of the hotel with a Tommy gun on his lap covered with a coat. After the imprisonment of Capone in 32, he handed the reins of his crew to his brother Ralph Bottles Capone, who was already considered Al's official capo over Cicero, effectively keeping the control of Cicero crew in the Capone family. He was followed by his top lieutenants and cousins, Charles and Rocco Fischetti. Next in line in the mid-30s Cicero power dynamic were top outfit associates Claude Maddox and Willie Heaney. Remaining members of the circus gang were absorbed by the newly reorganized crime family, which is now headed by Frank Nitti, although it seems the real power behind the organization was the Rica Campagna ruling panel. Maddox and Heaney began to climb up the ladder in the outfit's hierarchy, and eventually both became prime forces in the most lucrative Cicero area. They were part of that first-class, first generation of the newly formed post-Capone Chicago outfit that would rule Chicago's underworld for the next 60 years. Both Ralph Capone and the Fischetti brothers were heavily surveilled and scrutinized by law enforcement. They couldn't leave the house without having their picture taken or being tailed by the feds. Eventually, all three of them began constantly traveling back and forth to Miami. This means that Maddox and Heaney were unofficially two of the most important members of Capone's Cicero crew still operating at full capacity. Their value to the outfit was so high at this time, mainly because they still killed people for the cause, and they were fiercely loyal to the organization and its leaders. They didn't cause problems, and above all, they brought in a lot of cash for the new leadership, now under the rule of Paul Ricca from the West Side Group. After a while, Heaney was constantly traveling down to Miami with Ralph Capone and sometimes Nitti. This left Maddox as the prime boss in Cicero. His headquarters was a tavern on South Cicero Avenue where he issued his orders and collected daily payoffs from gambling and extortion payments from unions and prostitution. As the 1940s rolled along, even with most of his friends from the top echelon sent to jail for the Hollywood extortion case, Claude Maddox's business was booming. Then one of his old underlings from the circus gang, Tony Accardo, became the new boss of the Chicago outfit and now was the head guy calling the shots for the entire organization. Accardo had great respect for his older companion and placed him in charge of a few of the biggest union rackets in Chicago. Maddox was in control of Local 450 of the bartenders, waiters, and waitresses union in Cicero. Claude Maddox, together with Danny Stanton, a feared ex-Capone enforcer and extortionist, took over the AFL Hotel and Restaurant Employees Union and the Bartenders International League of America. The two gangsters' plan was to destroy the local autonomy of all the member locals by setting up a master contract for negotiations with employers. Thus, the council would direct the destinies of over 35,000 hotel and restaurant workers. In 1941, the Chicago Crime Commission listed Claude Maddox as public enemy number 8 and also reported him as being one of the biggest threats for the unions in the city. By now, Maddox belonged to the Big Four in the union business, among other gangsters such as Murray Humphreys, Danny Stanton, and Frank Nitti. Danny Stanton was a real hothead and started to muscle in on every possible union in the city of Chicago and even those already controlled by the outfit. With his imposing figure and experience, Stanton was a professional for intimidation. He previously rose as a criminal independently and later was absorbed by the former Capone gang. But by the early 40s, and with the massive overtaking of the unions, Stanton, blinded by his ruthlessness, started making problems for the outfit. He started butting heads with Claude Maddox over a restaurant and bartenders union scheme because he wanted a bigger share. He also started to muscle in on another prominent outfit racket, a numbers racket which was controlled by Sam Golfbag Hunt. He managed to piss off 3 outfit associate heavyweights, Maddox, Hunt, and Ralph Pierce. Stanton had been playing loose and had been enjoying a hands-free approach at terrorizing bars and unions with his muscle. He was power-hungry and wanted to be the top gangster in the city. He figured with Capone long gone and Nitti dead and most of the outfit big shots away for a while because of the Hollywood extortion case, his chance was now ripe with potential. Stanton enjoyed many years of wealth from his connections with the outfit, but now those times were over. On May 5th, 1943, just before midnight, Stanton and his buddy Louis Dorman were standing around the bar at the 6500 Club on May Street. Their backs are facing the rear door as Stanton is about to raise a bottle of beer to his lips. 2 shotgun-wielding outfit hitmen kicked the door open and sent 3 blasts toward the unsuspecting gangsters. Dorman got one in the back and Stanton got one in the back of the head. The third blast hit a patron standing further away from the bar. Interestingly, after the shooting, the killers ran back out the back door, made their way around to the front and fired 3 more shots from a revolver through the glass panels of the front door before making their getaway. Not that they needed to. Stanton and Dorman both lay dead on the floor. And that was the end of Danny Stanton. A young blonde named Cecilia Ashley was one of the witnesses who was sitting next to the dead gangsters and saw the killers. Her friends advised her to go to the police, so she decided to go for it. On May 8th, Miss Ashley left her house and started walking down to the Inglewood police station, but never managed to reach the place because she disappeared from the face of the earth. Later, the cops were looking for Claude Maddox and Sam Hunt in connection for the double murder and the missing woman. They were both arrested and questioned about the killings. Of course, these 2 seasoned gangsters kept their mouths shut, and as usual, they were released and everything ended with no results and both cases went unsolved. Now Maddox, as a senior member of the organization, was riding high and also had his own voice in Chicago's criminal commission. He remained a prime force in Cicero together with his jailed boss, Louis Capena. By now, 2 of Maddox's prime underlings were Joey Aiuppa and Robert Insani. Together, they were operating the Town Hotel in Cicero. Besides functioning as their base of operation, it was also a big gambling spot filled with prostitutes. Joey also operated the Town Review, one of the sleaziest places to ever operate in Cicero. The Town Review had a bar in front with a small stage for strippers. B-girls hustled drinks and sex. They would sell you sex on a table in back, or for a slightly higher price, lead you into one of 4 cubicles in the back with a mattress on the floor for more privacy. Oh, and clean sheets were available for a separate extra charge. Pretty classy joint, huh? Other gangsters such as Willie Heaney, Joseph Corngold, Ralph Capone, and another ex-Capone gangster, Tony Mops Volpe, were all frequent guests. Maddox knew Aiuppa since the 1930s through his connections and other various gangs. Interestingly, Aiuppa worked closely with the infamous John Dillinger gang and also the Barker Karpus gang. He used to help him out and provide these gangs with weapons and hideouts. Joey O was a tall, strapping young man. Known as a smooth and well-dressed womanizer, Joey wasn't book smart at all, but he sure had plenty of street smarts to go around. Maddox noticed the potential and felt he could mold this one into a proper gangster, so he took him under his wing and showed him the ropes of a racketeer, gangster etiquette, the rules of the Chicago wise guy, and how to properly hone and utilize violence for maximum effect. Aiuppa knew that his mentor was an underworld legend and that his name carried major weight in the Windy City, and he understood how to use that to his advantage. In 1935, 7 gangsters, including Aiuppa, were arrested regarding various holdups on golf courses in Chicago. Aiuppa was asked who he's working for, and he answered, "You know me, I'm working for Johnny Moore." Within a few minutes, Aiuppa and the rest of the gangsters were released. Eventually, Aiuppa ran most of the gambling and bookmaking operations for Maddox. The pair also managed to spread their bookmaking operations into Melrose Park with a little help from their old associate and boss of that area, Rocco DeGrazia. Well, in other words, Aiuppa was Maddox's #1 guy. And apparently he was well aware of that fact. Aiuppa reportedly bragged that he was the #2 guy in Cicero after Maddox. The infamous Cicero crew played a major role in securing the parole for their jailed superiors in the Hollywood extortion case. If the bosses remained in jail for a very long time, that could have been detrimental for the mob in Chicago. Claude Maddox, Willie Heaney, Fiefke Korngold, Ralph Capone, and Joey Aiuppa together collected over $100,000 in donations for the bosses. Through their efforts, they managed to settle the $500,000 back tax debt for about 20 cents on the dollar. The Cicero guys collected another $160,000 that went to the judge, and the final step was to send a $500,000 bribe to the parole board. Once that was done, on August 13, 1947, the bosses were set free after serving just 3 years and 4 months of a 10-year sentence, an early release facilitated by the Cicero crew. By 1950, Claude Maddox had control of most of the unions in Chicago. Maddox placed the Lardino brothers, John and Dan, as overseers of his union enterprises. The brothers were both known as killers, extortionists, and made members of the Chicago outfit. Maddox was a lifelong criminal. He was a major force in Cicero and a huge earner right up until the end. Throughout the 50s, the outfit would continue to lose some of their top leaders. In May of 55, Louis Campagna died of a heart attack. Then in June of 58, Maddox died of a heart attack, leaving Aiuppa as the main power in Cicero. Joseph Aiuppa was born in December of 1907 in Chicago's Melrose Park area to Simone Sam Aiuppa and Rosalia Aiuppa Greco, who previously both came from Palermo, Sicily as immigrants in 1914. Joey's father Sam was quite the respected individual among the Italian community. He was a prominent member of the Melrose Park Lodge of the infamous Union Siciliana. Joseph Aiuppa dropped out of school in the 3rd grade at the age of 10 and started working as a gardener. Reports say that Joseph almost didn't have any type of education and was allegedly a very illiterate individual. On the side, he trained boxing and was considered a promising amateur boxer. Just like Paul Kelly, Aiuppa used an Irish name so he can get more and better fights. So Aiuppa used the alias Joey O'Brien, which would follow him into his mob career. By 1925, Aiuppa was already driving trucks filled with bootleg whiskey or beer and also received a new job at the Midwest Cartage Company. So for the first time in his life, young Aiuppa was making some serious cash on his own and started making connections with criminals from the outfit and other ethnicities. Sometime during the 1920s, Aiuppa joined the Capone mob and became one of their younger associates. One young gangster known as George Brigadis was one of Aiuppa's main connections to many criminals from around the West Side and was the one to make the introduction for Aiuppa to Maddox. An introduction that would change the trajectory of Aiuppa's life and the landscape of the Chicago underworld forever. Even though Aiuppa originally came from the city's west side, he still joined Capone's personal crew from around the Cicero and South Side areas, which was the leading group at the time, although his heart always remained in Melrose Park. In 1931, Al Capone officially became the representative for the Chicago mob on the National Mafia Commission, and around the same time, Aiuppa decided to marry a beautiful girl from his neighborhood known as Angelina Dolores Aiuppa Zito, and his best man was his old pal, Robert Insani. Same as Aiuppa, Insani was also connected to the outfit since the 1920s, and also had quite a long police record. Insani would become Aiuppa's right-hand man and partner in crime for many years. By this time, Aiuppa became an official associate of Maddox's crew and entered the outfit ranks. Then in 1933, the Chicago Tribune listed Aiuppa as a member of the Capone Syndicate and also as an enforcer of their unions. Both of Aiuppa's bosses, Maddox and Heaney, were two of the most feared individuals within the Chicago outfit, who would kill anyone at any given time, and were more loyal to the local Italian mafia than some of its actual members. Aiuppa couldn't have had two better gangsters for mentors. Aiuppa was rising through the ranks and his stock was on the rise. That was evident in the fact that he was partnering up with some of the heavyweights above him in the hierarchy. Aiuppa became a main partner with Ralph Capone, Louis Capagna, and Claude Maddox in the Turf Club, a nightclub on West Cermak Avenue which was known for its after-hours gambling and prostitution. Aiuppa also became a partner in the Taylor Company in Cicero together with Insani and Maddox, which was a front for the transportation of gambling devices like slot machines around the city of Chicago and beyond. They made over $500,000 a year from this enterprise. During that time, Aiuppa and Maddox also became owners in the Greyhound Recreation Center, the Paddock Lounge, the Post Time Lounge, the Magic Lounge, and the Circle Club. They even owned another firm which is called AMA Advertising Company, which is used for the manufacturing with the silkscreen process. Since Aiuppa also kept his old influence around the Melrose Park area, he and Maddox also managed to spread their slot machine and vending machine operation with the help of one of their old Cicero buddies, Eddie Vogel. The crew's multi-million-dollar income mainly came from gambling and unions, such as Local 703, 731, 110, 450, and 593. After Ralph Capone's retirement, it's quite possible Aiuppa either was the unofficial capo of the crew or officially became Ralph's successor. Some sources say Aiuppa allegedly became capo during the late 1940s, while others say it was during the early to mid-1950s. Whatever the case, one thing is for sure, Aiuppa was probably made captain under the rule of Tony Accardo. By the time Joey Doves took over, Cicero had become a major money-making machine thanks to illegal gambling, slot machines, prostitution, and union control. Joey Doves focused much of his energy on the Strip, which was a long stretch of saloons with slot machines and illegal gambling dens and whorehouses along Cicero Avenue. It was an ideal spot for vice operations, and Aiuppa was sure to take advantage. Aiuppa built his empire in Cicero, and the Strip was his sweet spot. Over the years, it became his bread and butter. And over time, it became apparent to the entire underworld that Aiuppa ran Cicero. The suburb was now his, and he ruled it with an iron fist all throughout the 1950s through the 70s. And outside Cicero, Aiuppa owned several real estate ventures, and he made that one of his specialties. He raked in massive profits from real estate throughout his career. As captain, Aiuppa had quite the crew of killers and earners under him. It's safe to say that Aiuppa's number two was his good buddy, Bobby Insani. He served as his bodyguard and helped Joey run multiple vice rackets. Under Aiuppa, Insani would become an outfit heavyweight in his own right. One of Aiuppa's top lieutenants and top earners was Joseph Korngold, who was also one of Cicero's biggest gambling operators and loan sharks. Korngold would eventually rise to the upper echelon of the outfit and become a staple within the Cicero underworld. He would often partner up with some of the top guys in Cicero on various business ventures. One such venture was a well-known dive in a big outfit moneymaker called the El Patio Club. From the mid-30s up until the early 60s, the El Patio Club was one of the premier outfit gambling spots. The El Patio Tavern was on the ground floor, but all the action was upstairs. Their large horse room could easily hold 100 or so bettors, as well as card and dice games in the evening. The majority owner was Louis Capagna, who had 60% according to Kefauver Committee testimony, while Willie Heaney and Joe Korngold each had 15%. All three men were also part owners in the Austin Club. This place was full of gambling operations running all day and night. It was equipped with hidden doors and secret exits, along with a fake tavern along the front to keep up appearances. Gambling at these two locations was a highly lucrative business. In a 1948 income tax case, Capagna admitted he earned over $200K from the El Patio and the Austin Club over a 4-year period from 1937 to 1940. The government begged to differ and argued that he received at least $564,000. Remember, that's in 1940s money. When Heaney and Campagna died in 1951 and 55 respectively, Korngold was left as sole owner of both joints, although it's likely he took on new partners. The El Patio and the Austin Club were raided several times over the course of their operations, and both places were finally closed down sometime in the mid to late 60s, but not before several Chicago wiseguys got filthy rich from them. Another big earner was Dominic Sinise, one of Aiuppa's main connections in the union business. Larry Rossano was also a top Aiuppa underling and driver. He would later control most of Aiuppa's prostitution operations. Aiuppa was arrested with Rossano in connection to illegal dice games which were held at the Frolics Club, which Aiuppa ran. That was another gold mine for Aiuppa in the outfit. According to investigators in the books they confiscated, in a single year the Frolics Club handled almost $2 million in bets, or around $28 million in today's money, give or take. A few other of Aiuppa's top guys from that massive Cicero crew: Joey's driver and bodyguard Pepsi Buonomo, Tommy Russo, Caspar Chiappetta, Albert and Matt Capone, Alphonse Carlisi, John and Dan Lardino, Tarquin Queenie Seminoli, Sam Cicero, Mops Volpe, Tony Granito, Vic Vita, Joe D. Delmonico, and top outfit hitman Vincent the Saint and Sarah. And Sarah was small in stature but a violent and dangerous fella. The man was greatly feared and respected. He was often used to handle a lot of outfit hit contracts and was as reliable and effective as they come. He became a close comrade to Aiuppa and was considered a heavyweight within the crew. Just like the big guy before him, Joey Aiuppa was an avid hunter. Back in the 1920s, Capone's passion for hunting really set him apart from all of his mafia comrades. Al's idea for blowing off steam and taking a break from the rackets was the great outdoors. The big guy loved that rural fresh air with a hint of gunpowder, and of course, above all else, he loved the thrill of the hunt. This passion of his made him unique among his cohorts. Capone often took hunting trips with a few of his favorite underlings. One such underling who would often accompany Al on these hunting excursions was Machine Gun Jack McGurn. I'm sure it was nice to take a break from the stress and pressure of being one of the top gangsters in Chicago. They don't have to constantly be on guard because the Northside Hit Team could roll up on them at any moment. They can relax and have a carefree day goofing around with each other and have a little fun. A feeling I'm sure they miss and haven't experienced since they were kids. It seems that Capone set the precedence for Chicago's favored hoodlum pastime. If there is a Chicago mobster who had more passion for hunting than Capone, it would be Joseph Aiuppa. He would go on quite a few hunting trips and even purchase rural land to help him facilitate his favorite pastime. Aiuppa would continue the mafia tradition in the Windy City that began with his predecessor, although it seems Aiuppa took it to the next level and went hunting a lot more frequently. These hunting trips are one of the many unique characteristics of the Chicago wise guy and sets the Chicago mob apart from the rest. Several pictures have surfaced over the years that were taken on these outfit hunting trips. Aiuppa was often pictured with his mob cohorts and underlings such as Tony Accardo, Pepsi Buonomo, and Michael Spilatro. And just like the Big Tuna, Aiuppa was also a fan of fishing. He may not have caught a fish as big as the one Accardo caught. Nevertheless, Joey never let his old age slow him down. Aiuppa's hunting prowess would also be responsible for his lifelong moniker. He wasn't known as Joey Doves until 1966 when he was convicted for attempting to smuggle mourning doves across state lines, violating the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918. He was sentenced to 3 months in the county jail and acquired the moniker that would stay with him for the rest of his life. As the 50s rolled along, it was becoming clear that Cicero was no longer the outfit's power base. The Taylor Street faction became the more prominent crew in the organization. Paul Rico is now the most powerful mobster in Chicago, and he's a Taylor Street guy. Plus, most of the old 42 gang alums reside in the Taylor Street crew, including the outfit's rising star Sam Momo Giancana. It became evident that Giancana didn't care for Aiuppa and was pushing the narrative that Joey Aiuppa is one of the weakest capos and the Cicero crew is considered washed up, even though Joey was a millionaire. Then, wouldn't you know, Giancana became the boss of the outfit, which wasn't good at all for Aiuppa. And it got worse a year later when Claude Maddox died. Aiuppa's protection was completely gone, and from that point he was on his own. Then, shortly after, Giancana allegedly assured Aiuppa that he was going to keep his crew together. Momo was apparently playing a little mental warfare with his outfit rival, because he didn't touch his crew, but he did ransack his rackets. Shortly after giving Aiuppa that false sense of security, Momo ordered him to share his operations with one of his 42 boys, Westside Captain Willie Potatoes Dodano. From that point on, both Aiuppa and Dodano used the town hotel as their headquarters, and Aiuppa had to get Dodano involved in a portion of his rackets. Giancana also assigned his underboss Frank Ferraro to supervise and direct outfit affairs in Cicero. How quickly things can change. In a blink of an eye, Aiuppa quickly dropped from the number 1 guy in Cicero to number 3. Humbling experience, I'm sure, but Aiuppa showed his moxie and experience by not getting emotional and raising hell, which would give Giancana a reason to whack him if he really wanted to. Joey kept his head down, did his job, and didn't make noise. And to make things worse, Maddox's interests that were supposed to go to Aiuppa were instead handed out by Giancana to his Taylor Street guys. Aiuppa's inheritance was basically torn apart by Giancana, and Aiuppa could do nothing but grin and bear it. This was unfortunate for Aiuppa, but at the end of the day, he still made tons of cash for himself and the organization. He followed every rule and didn't cause trouble. Joey O just kept quiet and focused on his rackets, biding his time, simply waiting for Giancana's reign to run its course. One thing Sam could not control was the fact that if he ever needed anything in Cicero, he had to go through Aiuppa. It was Joey who cultivated relationships with the unions, the town officials, politicians, and Cicero law enforcement for all those years. Giancana couldn't deny that Aiuppa had Cicero in his pocket. Aiuppa personally took care of the Cicero PD by handing them envelopes on a monthly basis. He reportedly would say, "Hey, all I want from you is information, so they won't kick me with the point of the shoe, but with the side of the shoe. You understand? If I make money, you make money, and you have a chance to make a little money right now." Do you think these cops driving new Cadillacs and wearing $100 suits are able to have those nice things on a cop's salary? Do you? You like nice things, don't you? Running game like this, Aiuppa simply redefined the corruption game. It seems Aiuppa was able to weather the storm, because in 1965 Giancana was sentenced to a year in jail for contempt, and Sam Teets Battaglia became the new acting boss for the outfit. Teets was another 42 Gang alum, but not any 42 Gang alum. Aiuppa knew Sam from around the Melrose Park area for years, so his situation vastly improved with Battaglia at the helm. Then the interrelational dynamics within the outfit slowly began to change for Aiuppa and his crew, mainly because bosses like Battaglia, Cardo, and Rica changed their opinion regarding Giancana and didn't want him around anymore. Other captains like Jackie Cerrone, Chucky Nicoletti, and Fifi Bucchieri started creating numerous joint operations with Aiuppa and his cohorts, who were previously ignored by Giancana. Things were back on track and Aiuppa was making money again with numerous outfit top earners, especially Fiore Bucchieri, who is considered a possible Giancana successor, and his top enforcer James Torrio, who once worked out of the Cicero crew when he first hooked up with the outfit. Before earning his button with the outfit, Torrio allegedly started his criminal career as an associate under Aiuppa's longtime cohort Joe Korngold as a gambling and juice loan collector. Aiuppa already knew Torrio for quite some time, as Turk was from both the Cicero and Melrose Park areas. So during this period it seemed all doors were open for Aiuppa and his crew, something which was long desired by Joey. Aiuppa and Ricardo would eventually bond over their shared passion for hunting. The pair dropped 20 grand on a hunting trip in South Africa, which brought the two experienced mobsters much closer together. This was a huge plus for Aiuppa and gave him a big advantage as he rose to the outfit hierarchy. Then in the late 60s, early 70s, Aiuppa had a stroke of luck. Remarkably, the entire upper crust of the 42 gang Giancana Taylor Street faction was completely wiped out within a few years. Most of them were taken off the board in the mid to late 60s, and by the mid 70s they were taken off the planet. About a year after Battaglia became boss, he was hauled off to prison on a Hobbs Act violation. He died shortly after his release in 1973. Willie Potatoes got pinched in 66 on a bank robbery conspiracy charge. He died behind bars in 75. Milwaukee Phil Aldericio succeeded Battaglia in 67. He lasted a couple years until he took an extortion pinch in 71. He died in prison the same year. Well, it wasn't the law that took Fifi down. It was cancer. Bucchieri got sick around 1970 and eventually succumbed to an advanced cancer in 73. Because Fifi was sick when Aldericio went away, well, that left Aiuppa as the front runner to be the new boss. Ricardo decided to elevate his hunting buddy Aiuppa, along with Gus Alex and one of the last 42 gang guys left, Chuck Nicoletti, as his personal overseers of the whole organization. Ricardo, of course, was the outfit's boss of bosses per se, and he placed Aiuppa as the new acting boss, with Gus Alex as an advisor and connection guy, followed by Nicoletti as underboss, who was the link between the administration and the rest of the capos and soldiers. It was finally Joey Doves' time to shine, and with Aiuppa moving up, the next guy to head the massive Southside crew was actually a Bucchieri underling, the ruthless Joe Ferriola. Born in Chicago's near west side, Ferriola's formal entry into the Chicago outfit occurred in the 1950s with Giancana's old 42 faction of the family. Ferriola's earliest verifiable ties was as a protege of Leonard Fat Lenny Caifano, a bookmaker, enforcer, staunch Giancana loyalist, and brother of Chicago outfit heavyweight Marshall Caifano. Fat Lenny mentored Ferriola in the organization's operations and structure, positioning him in the gambling operations that served as gateways for street-level recruits in the 1940s and 50s. His early assignments included collecting debts from gambling operations and juice loans and handling minor extortion rackets in the Cicero area. Ferriola eventually transitioned to working under Fiore Bucchieri, a high-ranking outfit lieutenant and loan shark known for muscle work and extortion and territorial disputes, learning the necessary tactics for maintaining control through intimidation and violence while achieving operational efficiency. During the 1960s and 70s, Joseph Ferriola held mid-level positions within the Chicago outfit Cicero crew. These roles helped Ferriola build a reputation as a reliable operative, valued for his unwavering loyalty and discretion in sensitive matters, which solidified his standing among senior figures. He steadily rose through the ranks, becoming a key enforcer for boss Sam Giancana under the direct supervision of Bucchieri, where he was described by federal agents as a cold-blooded terrorist and one of the mob's most feared members. Fifi eventually put him in charge of North Cicero, so Ferriola oversaw rackets including illegal bookmaking and juice loans in their area, while demonstrating his ruthlessness through extreme violence and prolonged torture of delinquent customers, rival gangsters, or simply administering discipline amongst their own guys. These rackets generated substantial unreported revenue for the outfit. Federal investigations later estimated that the outfit's gambling operations, like those of the Cicero crew, contributed millions annually to the organization's income. Ferriola kept moving up the food chain. He then expanded his reach and headed the syndicate's gambling operations across northern Cook, Lake, and McHenry counties for several years, and acted as a roving crime boss overseeing various underworld projects. Ferriola maintained close ties to upper-ranking outfit figures, most notably Joseph Aiuppa, who also rose through the ranks of the Cicero crew. Ferriola acted as a key operational enforcer under Aiuppa's direction. Their association facilitated Ferriola's involvement in broader outfit ventures, one of which being leading the Cicero crew. When Aiuppa assumed leadership of the outfit in '71, he and Accardo then decided to promote Ferriola to take his old spot as the main capo of the Cicero crew. Ferriola's crew ran several gambling enterprises and employed violence and intimidation to collect money, and was used by the administration to enforce outfit discipline by employing lethal violence against non-compliant members or rivals. He and his crew built themselves up a significant reputation for violence and brutality, as they wouldn't hesitate to beat someone down or smoke someone in broad daylight, or even snag someone right off the street and take them to a different location for prolonged torture sessions before they're killed. He was eventually tasked with putting together an enforcement arm for the entire organization. This unit would be a sub-crew of the Cicero crew and under the direct supervision of Ferriola. Joe put together a dream team of ruthless and efficient killers that would go on to kill scores of people throughout the 70s, earning themselves the moniker the Wild Bunch. He would put his nephew, Harry the Hook Ailman, in charge of the death-dealing crew, which also included Butch Petrocelli, Jerry Scarpelli, Jimmy Inandino, Tony Borsellino, and Jerry Scalise. This crew would successfully satisfy every murder contract handed to them, ultimately being responsible for what authorities estimate to be hundreds of murders before it disbanded in the 80s. Outfit bosses seemed almost impenetrable since those Taylor Street boys went down years ago. Their era of invincibility ended in the mid-80s when their Vegas shenanigans caught up with them. The outfit's hand was caught in the cookie jar, and Aiuppa and his underboss Jackie Cerrone went to prison for skimming casinos. Joe Batters again managed to dodge another major indictment. What a crafty guy, incredible. Accardo then decided to elevate Joe Nagal to operations chief, effectively making him the de facto boss. Joe Ferriola delegated the day-to-day crew operations to his trusted number 2, Ernest Rocky Infelise, and Rocky was named the new captain of the Cicero crew. Rocky Infelise's road to the upper crust of the outfit was a bumpy one. He was actually run out of Chicago in 1960 because he had sizable unpaid gambling debts on horse racing. He fled to New York and hid out in Hot Springs, Arkansas, operating a bookmaking office. He eventually was able to resolve the unpaid debt, and Rocky came back to Chicago and re-entered the ranks of the outfit, joining the Cicero crew under Ferriola. The 300-pound Infelise has massive hands and forearms, dark dead eyes, and a starkly menacing presence. A horse racing enthusiast, Infelise has a criminal record going back to 1952 with arrests for murder, burglary, armed robbery, and narcotics trafficking. He has also been convicted for firearms violations and the theft of $1 million in silver bullion. Rocky would end up falling under the tutelage of Turk Torrio. Infelise acted as his bodyguard and driver for a while, learning the ropes from the highly regarded outfit leader. Torrio was as vicious as they come. Well known for his propensity for extreme violence, Torrio was also a top-notch racketeer and organizational leader, all of which rubbed off onto his protege Infelise. Torrio did a fine job molding Infelise into a well-rounded mafioso. Infelise would also become tight with Jonah Gall. Rocky went everywhere with Ferriola, eventually becoming his main muscle. Besides Ferriola, Rocco was also a constant companion with former NFL football player turned outfit hitman Wayne Bach. Bach had a pretty stellar collegiate career with the University of Illinois. The 6'5", 260-pound blonde beast played well as a defensive back for the Fighting Illini. He was picked up in the 5th round of the 1957 NFL Draft by the Chicago Cardinals, which is what they were called before the Bears. Bach's NFL career was brief and unremarkable. In his first and only season, he appeared in 4 games, starting 2, but recorded no stats. He got hurt the next year and didn't play a single game in '58, spending the entire season on injured reserve. Bach retired from professional football the following year at the age of 23. After retiring from professional sports, Wayne Bach transitioned into criminal activities with the Chicago outfit during the early 60s, leveraging his imposing 6'5", 260-pound physique to serve as muscle for the organization. Bach's reputation for brute strength made him a key asset in maintaining discipline and collecting debts. Bach would develop a close friendship with Infelise early on. The pair were often used as muscle for Torrio, Ferriola, and Carlisi. Whether it was a hit contract, broken leg, or a simple beatdown, this dynamic duo easily implemented the proper amount of violence the situation called for. Simply the presence of these two guerrillas was all it took to get the job done most of the time. Bach also bounced around the organization. After spending his formative years with Ferriola and Infelise in the Cicero crew, Bach then worked out of the Grand Avenue crew under Joey the Clown Lombardo. During this time, he often partnered with outfit killer and enforcer Frank the German Schweiz, collaborating on enforcement duties and contract hits. It would be his time palling around with Schweiz that contributed to his reputation as a top hitman within the organization. Similar to Eldoricio Nicoletti in the 60s, Schweiz and Bach made a formidable hit duo, as authorities attributed several unsolved murders to the pair, most notably being the gangland slaying of Alan Dorfman. By the time the 90s rolled around, Bach made his way to yet another outfit crew. A 1997 Chicago Crime Commission report titled The New Faces of Organized Crime profiles Bach as a reputed hitman for Johnny Apes and Monte Leone's Chinatown crew. He was eventually exiled from Chicago in the late 90s by his former boss, Joey the Clown Lombardo, due to his involvement in drug dealing and a failure to share profits from rackets. And that was the end of Wayne Bach in Chicago. They didn't have those kinds of problems with Rocky. He was a stickler for the rules, loyal as a dog, and never caused any problems since he came back to Chicago. And he's been steady rising through the ranks. He had a widely known reputation as a brutal enforcer and a stone-cold killer. He eventually proved his value and loyalty over the years, positioning himself as one of the more prominent gangsters in Chicago and a leader within the organization. He eventually took over for Ferriola and put in charge of one of the most ruthless of Chicago's organized crime street crews, protecting the mob's street gambling interests and operating out of flash trucking on Laramie Avenue. It may have belonged to Al Capone back in the late 20s, but by the time the 90s rolled around, Cicero was owned by Infelise, and everybody knew it. But until then, Rocky's got some work to do. Stay tuned, part 2 coming out shortly.